Well, welcome everyone. Glad to see you this morning. Welcome to one of the adult Bible classes, I should say. Everybody except for Craig. Now, we're in the adult auditorium class. We began, I guess, 2 weeks ago now, a new series in this class. It's a series called Little Known Bible Heroes. I guess you can read that on the slides, but that's the title of this series. And in light of the VBS season, which we're going to be starting here pretty quickly in about a week, I guess, we want to look at some Bible characters. Maybe it's some Bible characters you haven't thought a lot about or haven't studied much on, and hopefully there will be some interesting things there for you. We began the first week just discussing these characteristics here to help us to look for these things as we're talking about some of these Bible characters. Last week we introduced our first character, a young lady named Abishag. We read in 1 Kings chapter 1 about her leaving her homeland and living in the palace with King David during the final weeks and months of his life, and all the turmoil that went on in that household, in that palace, and her being privy to all of that as a very young lady, and the courage that she showed and the trustworthiness that she displayed in her life. And so when we look at these characteristics, we see very similar things in the characters that we're going to be looking at in our study. I forgot to mention it last week, but if you haven't picked up an outline for the series, there's a stack of them on the table back there, and you're welcome to pick one up, and then you have an opportunity to see what's coming, and you can look ahead. So take advantage of that. There is 12 characters that we're going to look at. We began our series with an introduction, so that covers 13 weeks. That's a quarter. This morning we want to turn in our Bibles and look at another female character. And this one is in the New Testament, and the lady's name is Dorcas. Now that may be a familiar name to you, but maybe you haven't thought about Dorcas in quite some time. In fact, we often read this passage, when we do read it, to look at the miracle that is performed rather than focusing on the individual. This morning we'll, of course, talk about this miracle, but we're going to also look at the characteristics of this woman whose name is Dorcas. Or you'll see as we read, she has another name as well. So we're just going to dive right in this morning in Acts chapter 9. It's a short reading, but we want to see if we could get the context of this passage and then look at the things that occur and try to understand why this person is heroic. And maybe you'll see some things that I didn't even see. So let's pick up in Acts chapter 9, and we'll begin with verse 36. And after we read the passage, we'll go back and spend some time discussing this event. Acts chapter 9, verse 36. I'm reading from the English Standard Version, and it reads, "Now there was in Joppa a disciple named Tabitha, which translated means Dorcas. She was full of good works and acts of charity. In those days she became ill and died, and when they had washed her, they laid her in an upper room. Since Lydda was near Joppa, the disciples, hearing that Peter was there, sent 2 men to him, urging him, 'Please come to us without delay.' So Peter rose and went with them, and when he arrived, they took him to the upper room. All the widows stood beside him, weeping and showing tunics and other garments that Dorcas made while she was with them. But Peter put them all outside and knelt down and prayed, and turning to the body, he said, 'Tabitha, arise.' And she opened her eyes, and when she saw Peter, she sat up. And he gave her his hand and raised her up. Then calling the saints and widows, he presented her alive. And it became known throughout all Joppa, and many believed in the Lord. And he stayed in Joppa for many days with one Simon, a tanner. So we have this event that occurs early in the history of the church of a woman being raised back to life after she has died. And this woman is called both Dorcas and Tabitha. One is the Greek, the other is the Jewish Hebrew name. And so she's became ill. Scripture doesn't give us much detail about her illness. All it says is she became sick and she died. So with that information, let's take a look at the context of what's going on here. Peter is making his missionary journeys. You may have thought about Paul as being the one that made missionary journeys, but Peter is traveling as well right after the early events of the church in Jerusalem. Peter is traveling and preaching the gospel. He is in a town called Lydda, where he is performing miracles. He is healing, and people are already aware of the wonderful things that are being done in the name of the Lord, and they know about Peter and what he's doing. And he's not far away from this town called Joppa, where Dorcas lived. At Lydda, he's summoned by disciples of Joppa. They go from Joppa to Lydda to search for Peter and beseech him to come back to Joppa. So they know about where he's at. We're not given all the details, but if your mind is like mine, you imagine all these details that they don't have to ask very many people to find out where Peter is, because this is big news in the town of Lydda. And so they may probably ask a few questions, and then people point him out immediately, and they go and find Peter and ask him to come to Joppa. They may or they may not have known who Peter was or have never met him before, but they understood that Peter had great power. They also understood where that power came from. They tell Peter that a beloved woman in Joppa has passed away and from an illness. We don't know if it was a long illness, a short illness, but they know that Peter can do something about it. It's interesting to me, one of the details that jumped out at me is that they didn't anoint Dorcas for burial. They simply washed her body and placed her in a room. We'll talk some more about that in a minute. But we also saw in our story that when Peter arrives, he returns back to Joppa with them. He arrives, he asks everyone to leave the room. He possibly, this is subjection, Jimmy's opinion, he may be recalling how his Lord performed a very similar act that we find in Mark chapter 5. Flip over, if you will, to Mark chapter 5, and let's look at that real quick. You'll see a lot of similarities. In Mark chapter 5, we won't have time to read through that entire chapter, but this is the events where Jesus is healing all around the Galilee coast and interacting with throngs of people. And he gets in a boat and he goes across to the other side. And in Mark chapter 5, we see that he's rejected in Nazareth, I'm looking at the wrong chapter here. He's brought into the Gerasenes early in that chapter, and he confronts a man who has demons. Jesus casts out the demons, sends them into swine, pigs. The pigs run off the cliff. And then Jesus makes his way across the sea, and we pick up at verse 21. When Jesus had crossed again in the boat to the other side, a great crowd gathered about him, and he was beside the sea. Then came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name, and seeing him, he fell at his feet and implored him earnestly, saying, "My little daughter is at the point of death. Come and lay your hands on her, that she may be made well and live." And he went with them. However, we know the story that as he's going along with this man, a crowd is gathered around him, and another woman reaches out and touches his garment. A woman who Scripture says had been bleeding, had internal bleeding for a very long time, and Jesus feels the power go out from this touch, and he turns and confronts this woman, and then he spends time talking to her as well as talking to the crowd about the faith that this woman has. And then, as that interaction is going on, he is told that the young daughter has passed away, and there's no point for him to continue on. But Jesus appears to ignore that instruction and continues on to the house of the ruler of synagogue, to Jairus. And we pick up down in verse 40 of Mark chapter 5. And when they laughed at him, but he put them all outside and took the child's father and mother and those who were with him and went in there and where the child was. Taking her by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha cumi," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, arise." And immediately the girl got up, began walking, for she was 12 years of age, and they were immediately overcome with amazement. We back up a couple of verses from where I started there in verse 40, and we find in verse 37, Jesus went into this room with 3 other men. He allowed no one else to follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. So Jesus performs this miracle after this child has passed away from an illness, and he speaks to the girl, and she awakes and gets up and resumes her life. So I say that Peter possibly remembers that event and understands the power that God has over death. And so he does something very similar, as we just read in Acts chapter 9. He tells everyone to leave the room, and he prays. And then he speaks to the woman, speaks to Dorcas, and tells her to arise. And she does. And the result of that event is that many people believed on the Lord. And Peter continues there in Joppa for some time, preaching the gospel and converting people to the Lord. So that's the brief context of this whole story. It's an amazing, powerful story. And it showed the people of this area, this region around Joppa. Everyone hears about this event. Everyone witnesses the great power of God through the workings of his apostle Peter. So there's a powerful thing that's done here, and it makes a great impact on the people around, and more specifically, it makes a powerful impact on those who were disciples, just as Dorcas was. And Peter remains in Joppa for many days. So this is the event that occurs. Now I would like for us to focus a little bit more on this woman, Dorcas, Tabitha. Well, let me first ask a question. Is there anything that Dorcas could have done to deserve being risen from the dead, being resurrected from death? Is there anything that she could have done in her life that showed that she earned this? She lived a righteous life, okay. Okay. That's right.
So there's some growth going on here with Apostle Peter, too.
Okay, yeah.
Because he is going to have to show the Lord that he believes that he can do this.
Yeah, it's. I certainly agree that this act was for more than one purpose. It was for Peter's faith. It was for the faith of those disciples in Joppa, and it was for the proclamation of the message that was being shared throughout all of this region, that the God who Jesus proclaimed and who now the apostles is proclaiming, his power is so great that even death has no power greater than his. And this physical example of a resurrection from the dead is really for the purpose of reminding people of the spiritual resurrection that will occur for all those who choose to serve him. That promise has been made that through Christ, that each of us as disciples can have that hope of resurrection. So there's a gospel story here in just this act that's being performed on behalf of this woman, Dorcas. Go ahead, Marilyn. That's a great point. Sure. All right. But there you go. That's a great point. Yes. The fear of death is probably something that can be a hurdle to so many people, and even those who are of the faith, if you will. Well, just a quick little survey of Dorcas. I'm told that her name, Dorcas, actually means a female gazelle or a deer, maybe possibly giving us some insight into what sort of woman she was. I don't believe it's meant that she could run really fast. I think it meant that she was kind and loving and timid, maybe, as a deer. Not one of those people who's out in front of everyone, but going behind the scenes type of a person. Scripture is very clear that she was a disciple. Now, when you hear the word disciple and read that in Scripture, what does that mean to you? What does disciple mean? A follower, okay. She had already become a Christian. She was a follower of Christ. And the Scripture is very clear that she was full of good works and charity. This woman was known for her good works. And what sort of good works was she doing?
Later they talked about her people holding the garment, tunics.
Yeah.
Other garments that she had made.
Right.
And she had made those and given them out to people or something.
It sounds like that she was well known for being what we would call today a seamstress, making clothes, and that she would make them and give them to the poor so that everyone would have clothes to wear. So she was had a reputation for being a woman who was very charitable, helping people out, and especially with their need for good clothing. Very difficult work. It wasn't the fact that she was a good seamstress. It was the fact that she chose to give away what she sewed. She sewed garments for others, and this is Jimmy's opinion, Jimmy's theory, she may have been one of the very first to pass away after becoming a Christian, because the time frames are very short between the day of Pentecost and how the gospel has spread to this region. And so, as kind of going back to what Richard had mentioned earlier, this could have been a very unsettling event for the church and the disciples there in Joppa. They're frantic. This woman has passed away. And it may have been a result of some misunderstandings early on about this gospel message, because they may have been, as Paul would have to deal with later in several of the churches, they were waiting for Christ to come back. They thought this would happen at any time now. And here we have a woman who has passed away, and people are not so sure anymore if the message that they heard was what was actually the truth. But as Richard mentioned, they didn't just sit on their hands and fret about it. They made a decision to do something. They don't know, I'm sure they didn't have an idea of what was actually going to happen, but they knew that they needed Peter, and they needed him as quickly as he could get there, because things were in turmoil. And so they go to find Peter. We talk a little bit more about Dorcas and the influence that she had on the people in her community. And her service, her works, her charity, it was a blessing to other people. Have you ever thought about the things that you do? Does it bless other people? Is it a blessing to them? Is something that we provide blessing other people? If we are striving as Christians to emulate Christ, then everything that we say, everything that we do should be with the motivation that I have an opportunity to bless someone else. We don't get any indication of selfishness for Dorcas, thinking that, if I can give away something that would make them beholden to me, and I can ask them for a favor later on. We don't see any of that kind of discussion here. She was willing to freely give of her time and energy and her expenses. Material cost money back then, just like it does today, to make clothes. And so she blessed other people with her service. And it's obvious, because as we read this passage, we could see the great grief that everyone in this community was experiencing because of her passing. They were grieved immensely. But her return to life brings great joy and great faith to those new Christians, as well as to others in the community, and to the whole region around Joppa. So this action of bringing back someone from the dead was one of the primary purposes, was so that the gospel could be spread even further than it had been already. Dorcas was chosen to show God's power over life and death. We've mentioned it a couple times already. And we could say the same thing for Lazarus. We could say that for the young lady that Jesus brought back to life, the 12-year-old daughter that he brought back to life. All of those were not just because that individual had great faith. They were because God was proclaiming that the message being preached was true, and that he had the power to control death. And so this was something that shook this community, but it was for the good. It brought this woman back to life. Now, did that mean that Dorcas would live forever? We just, of course the answer is no. In fact, who knows, she may have become ill later on and died again. We don't know. We don't believe that she's still walking around somewhere. And that wasn't the purpose of that resurrection. Yes, she was a good woman. Going back to the question that I asked earlier. She was a good woman, a great woman. She did wonderful work. But none of that work earned her this miracle. This miracle was for a lot of good reasons, but it wasn't so that she could be rewarded in this life for the good works that she was doing. Her reward would come later. we can only imagine, but she probably picked up right where she left off and started making more tunics. We just don't know. But she was chosen to be an example, a powerful message to the world. Dorcas, maybe we wouldn't consider her a hero, but I believe there's some characteristics. I see Greg's hand. I believe there's some characteristics that she's got some heroic abilities. So we'll talk about those in a second. Go ahead, Greg.
I was just going to say, I just noticed the people that were standing around. It didn't say the disciples were standing around. It said the widows were.
The widows were standing around. That's right.
The group of people she ministered to.
Yeah.
Those that didn't have anyone else.
That's right. They were the ones that were showing the most grief, weren't they? Now, I could just imagine that those widows were able to influence the two men that they sent to live in. So there was some interplay between the widows and the rest of the people there. You don't just jump in your car and make a trip. It was about 20 miles, I think, is what I remember reading. I could be wrong about that distance, but somewhere there about 20 miles from Joppa to Lydda. They didn't jump in their car and drive up there. It was probably at least 2 days' journey, and I can't even imagine myself traveling 20 miles in one day, but they probably could back in those days. But it was a pretty good journey to go and find Peter and bring him back. So there was some willingness on the part of others to accomplish this and get Peter to come back. And the widows, of course, were the most impacted because, as Craig said, she ministered to them. But we can see that her influence was great, a powerful influence. Everyone was concerned about this event. The disciples, as well as the people in the community, they all knew who she was and what she was doing, and they all were grieved because of her passing. And she had a servant heart. We talk about that, even today, having a servant heart. It's such a powerful thing to see when you can look at someone else and see and recognize this willingness to serve and help others. So often we talk about it that some folks have the opportunity to stand in front of others and be more visible. But this servant heart is even more so, I would say, an opportunity to impact the lives of others. And Dorcas certainly impacted lives. She was highly regarded by all who knew her. These are heroic characteristics, whether we decide that this doesn't fit our definition of hero, but these are heroic things that she has dedicated her life to. Not just once or twice. I can gather fairly easily from the scripture that she did this continually. And people were amazed at her. They loved her. And as we've already mentioned, we had a couple of men who were willing to make this trip to go find Peter and bring him back. She was that impactful in their lives that they were willing to give up their jobs for a short period of time. They were willing to leave their own families and go find Peter and bring him back to Joppa. These are characteristics that are heroic. They're so powerful. And most of the commentators that I read seem to indicate that she was a Hellenistic Jew. And I'll probably get Lee to define that a little bit more, but that she had part of her family was Greek, part of her family was Jew, but she converted to Christianity, even though this was a period of time when it was very challenging for a Jew to accept Christ. And because the family pressures, because of pressures from the synagogues, the Jewish leaders. All of those things would bring oftentimes persecution on Jews who chose to follow Christ. And this reveals probably to me that there was some great courage in this woman, Dorcas, who heard the truth, understood the truth, believed the truth, and decided to change her path, no longer live under the Old Testament law, but to serve Christ. There were early in the church in Jerusalem numerous Hellenistic type Jews that had converted to Christianity. And it continued on as we read through the book of Acts, this conversion of these individuals. And she may have been one of the early ones, one of the first ones, who made up her mind really quick that this is the path that I need to follow. Lee, you want to add some thought to that?
Sure. The process of Hellenizing the Jews was begun, under the Greeks, and Antiochus Epiphanes, doing his thing in Palestine. But these were people that had turned away from the heavy ritualistic devotion to the Hebrew way of life and adherence to the law of Moses, had become very secularized and assimilated into the Greco-Roman culture. So they were not Gentiles, but they were not pure Jews. So they were kind of adrift somewhere in the middle. And they were very similar in that respect to the Samaritans.
Yeah,
they were cultural half-breeds. And so it was an interesting group. If you read on chapter 10 is where Peter goes to the house of Cornelius. And so I always look at this as the impact it had on Peter, because I think Peter knew that God could raise people from the dead, but I don't think he fully believed that God could save the Gentiles. And it seemed like that. Now that's the miracle: is can God actually save these Gentiles?
Right.
And I think this was as much for Peter's faith in what God was doing as it was for the people there in Joppa.
Absolutely, that's a great point. Peter still needed some convincing.
Yeah, he did.
And when you focus on Peter for a minute here, it's amazing that he allowed the Spirit to lead him away from Lydda, where he was making a powerful impact, but he was led to Joppa, and then he stays in Joppa and continues to preach the gospel after he raised Dorcas from the dead. So that it tells me that Peter is still willing to be led by the Spirit and to do what he's been called to do, but he still is wavering a little bit. And as Lee said, this is probably the last nail that helped convince him that he needed to proclaim the gospel to the Gentiles. Now we know he's still going to have some issues as he continues on, dealing with Cornelius, dealing with Paul, and all of those things that come along. But it was certainly a challenge for Peter. But this was a powerful event, and Dorcas was a part of it. She was a hero. And there's some things that we can learn from Dorcas. First of all, we can learn that, and I put this in here just for us to contemplate our own mortality. We all, I'm going to speak for everybody here because this is the way I feel. I'm assuming you feel this way. We love living here on this earth. We love serving God. We love the fellowship of the other saints that we spend time with, we worship with. But faithful servants, those who have committed their lives to serving God, will still suffer and they will still die. Dorcas, by all accounts, was a faithful child of God. She became ill and she died. That's part of life. There is going to be a resurrection for each of us, not in this life. And you may be as I am. Each day you get a little more older, a little more feeble, and you think, I don't want to live a long life, extraordinarily long life. on this earth, because it can become painful. You deal with sorrows and trials and tribulations, but there's a great reward waiting. I see Marilyn's hand. Go ahead, Marilyn.
Going back to your point on the last slide, and we're accepting the fact that she was a Jew who then followed Christ. Couldn't we add courageous
Absolutely.
to her list of, why she is a hero?
I agree.
If that would have taken a lot of courage, I would assume that period to leave the Jewish faith and, follow Christ.
Oh, yes, I fully agree with that. The pressure would have been really great upon her when she made that decision. From family, more than anything else. Unfortunately, families can be a hindrance sometimes. But life here on earth is not meant to continue on. I can't help but share personal experience. My father was a faithful gospel preacher for all his life. He suffered terribly with ALS at the end of his life, and usually the last thing that occurs with ALS is the diaphragm can no longer push the lungs up to draw air in and let the air back out. And so he suffocated to death. He suffered and he died. But his life was a testimony that he believed that there was a resurrection. And he was able to pass that on to his children and grandchildren. So it's a life lesson for me, and as I consider these things, I realize that there's a greater blessing than just enjoying life here on this earth. Go ahead.
Of the mortals that God raised from the dead, I think we have to trust God's providence and God's wisdom in choosing the ones that he did that, because he's now placing them at risk again by bringing them back from the grave. If they were, in grace when they died, now they're back at risk again.
Right.
And so, God's wisdom in choosing which of his servants he would do this for, I think speaks volumes.
Yes, I hadn't even thought about that in that aspect, and you're absolutely right. God, in his infinite wisdom, decided which individuals will be brought back. And Dorcas was one of those individuals. God's power is greater than death. If we don't get that from this story, there are many other stories that we could look at in Scripture. He has that power. Yes, sir?
I was just going to say, you see that Stephen, and then a couple chapters later, James,
Right.
though they're not resuscitated from the dead, God's ways are higher and harder, so we need to trust in his ways. I can't help but think about how much we see Peter's faith grow. In Matthew 16, Peter rebuked the Lord and said, "No, I want you to go to the cross. You will not go to the cross." But here we see him using the same words in the original language that Jesus used. You are right.
Yeah, that's
Instead of trying to beat Jesus at this point, allowing Jesus to lead.
That's right. And you remind me that Paul apparently suffered with some affliction, and I guess forever there will be debates about what that was. But God told him that my grace is sufficient for you. He wasn't healed. He had to endure whatever it was. Many think that it was some physical problem that he had. But God, in his wisdom, decides who is going to be healed, who's going to be brought back to life. But it's all for God's glorification, not for the glorification of the individual who was healed, or the individual who was brought back to life. So it's important that, like Dorcas, we understand that what we do should glorify God. not glorify us. And I think there's a whole thing to consider there, that her return back to the people in the community wasn't just so that she could make a few more dresses or tunics. It was so that people could see a visible representation of God's power and come to believe and to commit their lives to a God who had such great power. So this was a miraculous event. It was a powerful event. It had an impact on a lot of people. But some people, as we know, followed Christ just so they could see another miracle. They just followed him around. But there were also those who came to believe and realized that this message was true and that they needed to obey it. Did you have your hand up, Craig? Okay. Thought I saw another hand there. Some people are really good hand raisers and some aren't. Another point to learn from Dorcas: in life and death, we impact others. I would like to think there would be few folks grieving when I leave, but I don't even imagine that there would be that impact that Dorcas had. The whole community, it almost sounds to me like most of the community grieving her passing. But even death can have an impact on lives. And so we can proclaim the message of Jesus even as we're suffering in this life. And it's a challenge sometimes, because in those times of illness and suffering are those times that we want to focus on ourselves. But we have to be careful about that, because people are watching to see how we deal with those challenges. And I think the most important lesson that we get from looking at the life of Dorcas and the lives of all Christians is that we have a promise that God, this God who's able to resurrect people back to life, also can resurrect our souls to eternal reward. Vaughn, go ahead.
You know, something that's interesting, Jimmy, with Dorcas and with others, speaking about objective, as far as why God raised people from the dead, it's interesting that there is God did not choose to record, which I'm sure everybody there asked him, what did you see while you were dead? That's not recorded. God was not focusing on giving a glimpse of anything. It was just, to your point, focusing on his power, that ultimately at some point we can all be raised again. But I find it interesting that there is no commentary at all, no comment from any of the people that were raised in life or whatever reason.
Yeah, you reminded me, Vaughn, that in the passage we read back in Mark, first thing that Jesus said after she was raised, he raised the 12-year-old girl, was give her something to eat. As you alluded to, if that occurred in this day and time, that would be the last thing on anybody's mind. First thing they'd want to do is interview her, and find out what's going on. And of course, she would be blasted all over the internet, all over the news, and it would lots of questions. But Jesus recognized the physical needs of this young girl who had been ill and had died. The first thing she needed to do was to feed her body and focus on the physical things. So there was, sometimes the Bible, in my opinion, is understated about a lot of things. And the life of Dorcas and the resurrection of Dorcas, we can imagine all sorts of things occurring after this event. But the Bible stays focused to the important points and how that this act impacted the spiritual lives of so many people. And it glorified God. Dorcas is certainly glorified, but not in the way that God is glorified through this event. Go ahead, Lee.
Well, we go back to the raising of Jairus' daughter. Jesus made a statement there. He said, she's only sleeping. And either that was true or false. And if Jesus is who he claimed to be, then it was true. But the scripture also says she was dead. So for both of those things to be true, then it argues toward the sleeping prior, or the death prior to the resurrection is a sleep of a spiritual nature.
Mm-hmm.
And so therefore wasn't like she went to heaven and was existing in heaven with God. She was merely asleep in the grave awaiting the resurrection. But again, that's opening a can of worms.
Yeah, I wish we had another hour and a half to get into
with
that.
Jesus, because they laughed at him.
Right.
When he said she's only asleep. And again, either that's true or it's false. And if it is true, and she was truly dead, then I think that gives us a little bit of insight into what's going on.
Right, right.
Well, I think as Christians, we keep talking all day about it. As Christians, we recognize that the Spirit is born once and lives forever. And yet, when we have funerals, we talk about them in the past. And I think we do a disservice to our faith when we talk about people in the past. Although their bodies lay in their lifeless, their spirit is still alive somewhere.
Mm-hmm.
And we shouldn't be talking about them in the past as if they don't exist anymore. The dead exist. It's just not in that body anymore. They passed on, but they still exist. And I think we as Christians really need to wrap our heads around that.
Yeah, I appreciate that comment. Well, I apologize for going over time, but thank you so much for your input. We'll try again next week with a different character.